So right now, with Israel facing its fourth election in 2 years, undergoing so many domestic challenges and divisive pressures, handling the coronavirus in a way which is not exactly brilliant, that's an understatement, and embedded, unfortunately, in a political stalemate without a budget, PM facing corruption charges, yet on the other hand, in a new Middle East ushered in by the Abraham Accords and the great changes that they represent. And on the cusp, of course, of having to work with the new American administration, the Biden administration, with the concern over one or several issues, but obviously one overriding issue, whether the assets garnered by President Trump in putting Iran under maximum pressure, all those assets will be built on or actually squandered in terms of going forward and handling Iran and the challenges it represents to Israel and its friends and allies across the Middle East. So, Haviv, we eagerly await your comments. The screen is yours to tell us about Israel's looming election and what are the implications at home and abroad. Welcome, Haviv.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin. You laid out, I think, very well the strange mix that we're dealing with. We have this regional war essentially underway between Israel and the conservative Sunni regimes on one side, the Saudis and the Gulf states, and that's leading to new alliances that we didn't expect 2 years ago. I mean, we've been cooperating with them in intelligence and under the radar for a long time, and then we have, at the same time, this looming threat from Iran that we don't know where it's going to go with the Biden administration. And internally, the Israeli economy is telling us both things at once. It's bounced back after each wave of lockdown better than most of Europe. And it's also gone into waves sooner. And we've seen, I think, larger problems of discipline and adherence to restrictions, and police having tremendous trouble enforcing restrictions. And so and the government's had, policy problems and problems in implementing policy that have been really ridiculous. The school year started in September. And for the first week of school, people didn't know when school was starting. The school year was starting, and then it wasn't starting, and then it was starting. And teachers literally found out the day they were starting work that year, the day of the day that the cabinet at midnight the night before decided that the school year can open. Decisions were made the week that school should have already have opened. So we've seen a lot of strength, a lot of fundamental underlying strengths. And a lot of governance problems and weaknesses, and so in that very ambiguous and strange atmosphere, both at the regional level, at the geostrategic, at the grand strategy level of Biden and Iran and the Saudis, and at the very, the virus has forced all of us to suddenly become much more aware of our narrow domestic place and our narrow domestic governance and our social issues. When the Haredim in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox, don't obey restrictions, other people get angry at them, and that tension suddenly comes to the fore. And then when the Arabs do, the Arab communities were very strict in adhering to the restrictions, and the virus still exploded there. And it turns out that there's this a little bit of an under current of pirate weddings, and a lot of people in the community just didn't think that this was something that they could not do for 2 years. They could just not marry. They could just not. And so we're discovering our social problems are coming to the fore. It's a very strange mixed time that's, I think, hard to make sense of. That's as true here as in Australia, as in the US. I want to focus on the coming Israeli election. There is an Israeli election coming. I'll make a couple of comments domestically. And I think there's something important to say about Joe Biden in that regard of where Israel is headed. And then we'll open it up. an election bill is advancing in the Knesset right now at this very moment. The Knesset House Committee is literally at this moment debating a bill to call new elections. There's almost no chance the bill will pass, at least in its current form. And the reason is that it's a bill controlled by Blue and White, which secretly doesn't want an election. It secretly would like to continue the government until November 2021, when Benny Gantz, the leader of the party, has a chance to be prime minister if the rotation agreement were to come to fruition that they signed back in May. That Gantz and Netanyahu signed back in May. So the chairman from the Blue and White Party of the Knesset House Committee is using the fact that the committee controls this bill to try and negotiate with Likud, maybe finding a way to delay as much as possible an election that nevertheless we're going to. The reason we're going to an election, regardless of what Blue and White tries to do, is that on December 23rd, the Knesset has to pass a state budget, or by law, the Knesset dissolves. A Knesset that can't pass it by the end of March of that fiscal year, in other words, a Knesset that can't pass a 2020 state budget by the end of March 2020 dissolves by law. And the Knesset has passed that deadline this year to August, and then again to December 23rd, and that's coming due. Now, it's a little cartoonish to suggest that it'll extend again the 2020 budget. February 2021 is coming. Netanyahu can no longer really call on any reserves of trust or hope in Blue and White. They've largely, I think, they still hope, they're still holding out, there's still some attempt to negotiate and think this through, but I think they've basically lost all hope and would rather have an election now when Blue and White is polling at 10 seats than in 6 months when they're probably polling, at 5 seats. So we're going to an election. We're probably going to an election. The Knesset's probably going to have to vote to dissolve itself on December 23rd. Election would be 90 days after that, give or take a week, probably around March 22nd. And what does that mean? Now, I suspect, I'll give our viewers a scoop. It's a scoop of my next article, so please still click on the article and click on all the ads. But the scoop is that this election is more dangerous for Netanyahu. That was a joke. I don't click on ads either. The scoop is that this election is more dangerous for Netanyahu than he believes. And the reason I say that is that we have 5 months of incredibly consistent polling, 5 months of incredibly consistent polling of Israelis. Through the deepest lockdowns and the biggest, waves of success, and the news about the normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates, and the news of, and the Trump being very nice to us, and then Joe Biden winning, and then all the different, turbulence of the news cycle. And the polls have been incredibly consistent. And what they've told us is that Benjamin Netanyahu and his core support includes people who are now clinging to Likud despite widespread disaffection with how this government is handled, widespread disaffection on the right with how this government has handled the pandemic. That core support is about 25 seats, 30 seats on a better, in the better polls, drops down to 25, 26 in the worse ones. And then there's a core support in the ultra-Orthodox parties, the Haredi parties, which poll at between 14 and 16 seats. And that core support is not really about Netanyahu so much as it's about everyone opposed to Netanyahu. On the other side of Netanyahu are the centrist, secularist parties like Israel Beitenu, a party of Russian speakers who are very much for reducing the power of the religious establishment in Israel. Yesh Atid, which was founded on the sort of demographic and political foundations of a party once called Shinui, which was a very, very militantly secularist party. The Haredim can't sit with them, and so they're left sitting with Netanyahu. So Netanyahu has this coalition with Haredim that has not polled in 5 months more than about 50 seats. Netanyahu is 10 seats short. On the other side, we'll call it center left, even though it's this incredibly diverse group from Moshe Ya'alon, who was the defense minister of Netanyahu and is on the right side of the Likud, but hates Netanyahu so much that he now essentially caucuses with the center left. all the way to, anti-Zionist Arab party like Balad, which is just an outright Palestinian nationalist party. You have this vast spectrum on the other side, and that spectrum has almost never in the last 5 months passed the 61-seat mark that is required for a Knesset majority. Now, the reason I'm taking this deep dive into the numbers is because you don't win an Israeli election on election day. And Israelis go to vote, they elect just one thing. They have a single thing to vote for in national politics, and that is a party list that they send to the Knesset. Every vote to a party list to the Knesset is counted, assuming the list gets more than 3.25% of the total vote. And then the Knesset reflects almost exactly the public will and the public, alliances and affiliations with these parties. And so the parties that end up getting elected to the Israeli Knesset reflect the divisions in Israeli society, the fractures, the tribes of Israeli society very, very accurately. And then with that Knesset that is elected on election day begins the coalition negotiation to build an actual ruling coalition and a government. And that's something much, much harder to do, to take 11, 12, sometimes it's been as many as 14 political parties, each one with between 4 and let's say 30% of the Knesset. Nobody gets more than 30 nowadays. To take 5 of those, 6 of those that you need to piece together to form a government. So the election is easy. And then figuring out who won is the next 3 months and is extremely complex, and it's a lot of this chaos math and negotiation. What we've seen over the last 2 years, of course, is that for 3 consecutive elections, they failed to figure out who won. They failed to piece together a coalition. So when we look ahead, it's not enough to say Netanyahu is going to be the largest party. He'll have 28 seats, he'll have 31 seats. The next in line will be 20 seats for Yamina or 17 seats for Yesh Atid. It's not enough to say who's the largest party. The question is what coalitions are possible. And there we find something fascinating. Netanyahu doesn't have 50 seats. Maybe he'll have 50. And the center left doesn't have 60. The anti-Netanyahu camp, which is this incredibly diverse group that all agree on this one thing, which is to get rid of Netanyahu, doesn't have 61. And the guy in the middle, who's risen astonishingly in the polls to 19 and 20 and sometimes 24 seats, Naftali Bennett, the head of the Yamina party, who is on security issues, on Palestinians, on land, on settlements, on those questions that are in many ways the defining questions of Israeli politics. Whether you're right or left has nothing to do with your economic policies. It has to do with your policy on Palestinian/land/national security and that whole ecosystem of issues. On that issue, he is to the right of Netanyahu. But he has drawn to himself probably as many as 10 seats. Then Netanyahu's Likud is 36 seats, polling at 27 seats to 31 seats. He might have taken 5 seats, he might have taken even 10 seats from Netanyahu over the anger and the frustration at the pandemic response. In other words, all of Netanyahu's achievements over the past year, and there have been some astonishing achievements, are lost to him electorally because of the pandemic response, because the budget has been frozen by him in an attempt to get out of the rotation agreement with Blue and White, the coalition partner that he signed that agreement with in May, in Netanyahu's behavior in domestic politics. Naftali Bennett will have, according to polls, 21 seats or so. The polls might be extraordinarily favorable to him. Netanyahu might run a phenomenal campaign. Bennett might lose 8 of those seats and drop down to 13. At 13 seats, Naftali Bennett is still the next prime minister. Here's how that works. Yair Lapid will be the head of the center-left camp, most likely. They're looking around for generals to take charge, for some new, exciting new champion to come into to lead a major center or left-wing alignment of some kind. Yair Lapid controls a party called Yesh Atid, which is the only party on the center-left that has a real activist base, that can send thousands of people to canvass, to stand at streets, corners, to hang banners. When Blue and White built this coalition with Benny Gantz's Israel Resilience Party and Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid Party, and they united a year and a half ago or 2 years ago already to form this Blue and White alliance that challenged Netanyahu, the entire activist base was Yesh Atid. It's a real party in a way that the other center-left parties are not. And so he's survived 8 years of Israeli politics with his party, which most center parties do not. And so he's quite likely to be the leader. He will have, a camp on his side. The Arabs are unlikely to go with Netanyahu. There's a small party, an Islamist conservative party on social issues called Ra'am that is thinking of working with the Israeli Jewish right, which is a brand new and fascinating thing that we've all written about a great deal. But the majority of Arab lawmakers and the majority of Arab parties are still going to be anti-Netanyahu at the end of whenever the election is. And then he has the Arabs, he has the left, the Meretz party, whatever survives of the Labor Party, and he has his Yesh Atid, and he has Benny Gantz or whatever that will be. He'll lead a camp. That camp won't hit 61. He needs to get to 61. He will turn to Naftali Bennett after the election, and he will say to him, and he'll do it an hour after the results are out, if not 10 minutes after the results are out, because he'll want to be the call before Bibi, Netanyahu. And he'll say to him, Naftali, Benjamin Netanyahu passed a law creating an alternate prime minister and a rotation agreement and all those institutions. That's all still the law. It was this strange thing created specifically for, the Gantz Netanyahu, whatever that was that we've seen, the prime minister, alternate prime minister rotation. They changed basic laws. They changed constitutional laws in Israel to have this exist. It exists. Let's use it. You are going to be, you Naftali Bennett, prime minister first. I'll be prime minister second. You and I, we're not Netanyahu. We trust each other. We don't lie through our teeth and sign something, and the minute after we sign it, start trying to wriggle out of it. And you get to be prime minister, and I get to be prime minister, and Benjamin Netanyahu gets to go into retirement. That'll be one of Bennett's choices. Now, that's a phenomenal choice. Bennett will be able to ensure that he'll be one of the larger factions in that coalition that'll cross the political gamut. It'll be about getting rid of Netanyahu. But there's not a lot of political issues that divide Israelis today. On economics, we're not very divided. There's some deep culture war questions like the Supreme Court and reforming how judges are chosen. And that's something that they're going to have to sort out. But that's what they're going to have to sort out. There isn't a sense on the center left, on the right, on the far right, that there's some kind of solution to the Palestinian conflict where because there's a solution, we should all be fighting about whether it's a good or bad solution. There isn't a solution, so there's nothing to fight about. I'm not saying that's the truth, I'm saying that's the general sense in the Israeli political scene. There are no debates come on election time about the economy, about the Palestinians. And so you will have a government that will be, I think, surprisingly stable in that situation. No one will have an interest in toppling it. And Bennett will get to be prime minister, and Lapid will finally, the only path he has to get to be prime minister. Everyone's on board. And between the two of them, they've almost sealed up the coalition. Bennett will have two other choices. Netanyahu will call him. Maybe he'll get the first call. Maybe he'll get the second call. He'll be the kingmaker, and Netanyahu's going to call him, and Netanyahu's going to say, Naftali, well done. I tried to beat you down, but you made it. Well done. Good job on your, hopefully for Bennett, 18 seats. Worst case scenario, 13 seats. Well done. I'll make you prime minister second. Now, the whole country has just gone through Netanyahu promising someone to be prime minister second, and just watching how Netanyahu when asked about the rotation, Netanyahu, by reporters, Netanyahu literally smirks. He doesn't even pretend to feel the need to be polite about the question of the rotation. So Bennett is going to say to him, Bibi, well done, but you wanted to get in this together. I'm first. Can Netanyahu stomach Bennett being first? It's not at all clear. Facing the prospect of a Lapid-Bennett prime ministership rotation, what's Likud going to do? Is it going to get rid of Netanyahu? It's extremely hard to see it getting rid of Netanyahu. Will it go into the opposition because of him? These are new questions. These are fascinating new questions that the coalition math raises that it didn't raise in the last 3 election cycles because the polls were completely different. Bennett has changed the entire picture, and it is easier now to calculate a path forward in which Bennett is prime minister than a path forward in which he's not. And Netanyahu should be worried. And so I argue that Netanyahu is rushing into an election thinking his polling is doing well, and by March he hopes there'll be a lot of vaccines in the country and will be slightly post-pandemic. And so some of the criticism of him by a lot of right-wing voters who have turned to Bennett will be forgotten. And those are his calculations and his hopes. So we might be going into very interesting times in Israeli politics. That was my comment on domestic. Do I have a minute for Joe Biden? Okay, folks, I want to say the obvious, and so I'll just say it and we'll move on to your questions, which are more interesting anyway. In the Middle East, everything changes. And one of the reasons between Trump and Biden, one of the reasons everything changes is not because America will suddenly come into the Middle East in a whole different way. It's because America has left the Middle East. America is gone. It really doesn't exist in the Middle East anymore. There's a 5th fleet of the United States that sails in the Mediterranean. That 5th fleet is a single ship docked in Rome. And there's a 2nd ship that belongs to the 5th fleet that's in Portugal, but not on the Mediterranean coast of Portugal. It's actually in the Atlantic. There's no ships left. The United States doesn't want to be involved. The one thing that Obama and Trump did together and jointly and in very shared way, and with tremendous continuity, even though they pretend to be very different on this, is not get involved in the Middle East under their watch. Pull out of Iraq, pull out of Syria, pull out of Afghanistan, not stop massacres, not intervene in any massive way in Lebanon to keep Hezbollah down. A lot of people in this region interpret the Iran deal that the Obama administration really crafted from 2015, the Iran nuclear deal that lifted sanctions in exchange for controls on their nuclear deal that Israelis have criticized as ridiculously inept. That's my personal view. Very, very smart people think it's an extremely good deal. So, go elsewhere for other views. But we interpret that deal not so much as a non-proliferation deal to keep Iran from getting nukes. We interpret it as a let Iran run its part of the region and let Iran stabilize the unstable Arab world around it, namely Iraq and Syria, in a way that others have not been able to stabilize. The Russians haven't stabilized Syria. The Israelis don't have the capacity. We have a powerful air force, but we have a very tiny population. We don't conquer. Outside of the narrow Palestinian question, we've actually pulled out of 85% of the land we've ever conquered in war, right? We can't step in with 100,000 troops into Syria and stabilize Syria in the way that Americans or Russians or Turks might want to. And so it's a lot of people in this region think that the deal was actually about making Iran one of the stabilizing anchors as regional powers of the region, freeing up its economy and telling Khamenei, essentially the leader of Iran, we will give you, legitimacy, the economy, your economy will be freed, stability, but you need to stabilize the Middle East. And one of the things about stabilizing the Middle East is that you don't nuke Israel. Right? Now, the Israelis think that that's a terrible arrangement because Khamenei just has to disagree 5 years down the road. That's what we think the deal was actually trying to do. And so the Saudis are now pivoting and the Israelis are pivoting and everybody's pivoting. We're not pivoting because Biden's going to have a different Middle East policy. We're pivoting because Biden's going to have a different Iran policy. And it's all about whether America is going to release the Iranian economy from sanctions without getting massive reduction in the infrastructure of the nuclear program, things like that the deal didn't do. So America has left. Everybody's trying to understand what it means for a Trump who didn't intervene in the region to switch with a Biden who probably isn't going to intervene in the region. Mainly the big strategic question is the question of Iran sanctions. That's just something I felt is important to say. So I'm going to stop there. and we move forward.
Thank you very much, Haviv, for that fascinating presentation. I'm sure that there are a number of questions. Ladies and gentlemen, again, just a reminder, using the raised hand feature inside Zoom, hit the participant tab, and at the bottom of the list of participants, you'll see a raised hand feature, and I already see some hands up. The first question tonight, I'd like to hand over to Colin to ask the first question.
Haviv, thanks very much. That really gives us a new understanding of the dynamics of this election and the polling which tells the story you're conveying to us, which I think is news to a lot of people watching tonight, and very, very informative. Just one specific one on the domestic situation. Will the Labor Party actually disappear at this election? And secondly, just on the Iran theme, I agree with you. You're absolutely right. It's the key question, and not just for Israel. But given that there are concerns about what a Biden administration may do with Iran, let it out of jail, how did the different potential prime ministerial candidates stack up in terms of being able to deal with that administration? For example, how would Naftali Bennett, as prime minister, do you think, be able to manage and deal with the Biden administration, as opposed to Prime Minister Netanyahu, obviously, or Lapid, or any of the other potential candidates? I know it's an impossible question to answer, but you may have some insights about their respective merits and abilities to deal with this looming major issue.
Both good questions. I'll just say the last poll we had on Thursday, the last major poll by a major news outlet, by Channel 12, gave Labor 2.5%, just under, I think 2.38% of the vote, which is, you need 3.25, you need 3.25% to get into the Knesset. So Labor, and there has not been a better poll for Labor, not for 5 months. You know, if Labor does make it in, it'll be by the skin of its teeth, and we're probably going to see Labor try and merge into another list to survive, so that it's whatever 3 MKs that are now there survives. Labor, for all intents and purposes, is dead. If it survives by essentially becoming someone else. So that's the answer on Labor. That's an easy one. The much more complex one, Bennett or others, or Lapid, a Prime Minister Lapid dealing with the U.S. I'll say this: there is a lot of bad blood when an American administration switches over. That's a revolution. I mean, it's an enormous organizational shift. They actually have a transition that is handled as a special organization, and they have to raise money for it, and they have to. Something like 10,000 senior officials are replaced when the White House changes hands. An American administration is an entire sort of decapitation. A new administration from a new party is a decapitation of the entire top level of the federal civil service. The civil service is several million people, and their replacement. So it isn't about Joe Biden. Joe Biden himself, I believe, I'm guessing, Obama surprised us by being deeply invested and fascinated with the Middle East. And we all thought he would be a very domestic president because he ran on very domestic issues and grew up in domestic issues, understood better domestic issues, frankly. His foreign policy successes are few and far between. And then he actually turned out to be a president fascinated by and eager to make a difference in foreign policy. Joe Biden is an old foreign policy hand. He's someone who was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate and knows foreign policy deeper than Obama ever did, probably still does. And so Joe Biden might have more of a focus on foreign policy at the beginning, but America is so divided and the problems are so acute, and the economic fallout of the pandemic, and it's hard to imagine that he personally is going to really spend time in the Middle East thinking about the Middle East. The Pentagon already long ago, I think in 2016, I don't remember exactly, wrote a document that defined China's rise as the great threat to the global order and all of this. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of Joe Biden, but there's going to be a lot of number 2 and number 3 and deputy assistant secretaries of state for non-proliferation types of people who are going to have a new conversation with Israel and a new conversation with the Israeli security establishment about Iran, about the Mossad, about assassinating people, about doing, we saw John Brennan be very angry at whoever it was. He doesn't know if Israel assassinated the former CIA chief under Obama. He doesn't know if Israel assassinated the Iranian nuclear weapons chief, a brigadier general named Fakhrizadeh a couple weeks ago. He doesn't know if it was Israel, but whoever it was a terrible and evil and vile violation of international law. One of the great violators of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in history was killed, and the former Obama CIA chief is angry at whoever killed him for violating international law, which again is a culture question. It's a question of where you put the priorities of what is, you know, important for the global order for stability and what isn't important for the global order and stability. So who is coming to power is essentially the question. It's almost the question, not is Joe Biden going to come into the Middle East and change everything, as who is Joe Biden going to delegate the Middle East to while he's off doing more important things in his mind. Therefore, Netanyahu is a very smart operator in the United States, and he's led by Ron Dermer, our ambassador there, who actually grew up as a pollster for Republicans in Florida, and then made Aliyah to Israel and got close to Netanyahu over the years through Natan Sharansky, but essentially as a political pollster, and slowly became one of Netanyahu's really close and important confidants and advisors on questions of America, American strategy, American politics, the Congress, the White House. It's Dermer who engineered Netanyahu's 2015 speech to Congress against the will of the president, of a sitting president. So Netanyahu is going to argue during the coming election campaign, I knew when to fight an American president, even in his own backyard, and I knew when to make a great alliance with an American president to deliver for us in a big way. And Bennett and Lapid are probably going to argue, you really don't want Netanyahu as the symbol and the spokesman of Israel when the Democrats are going to run everything, especially if Georgia turns out to send the Senate, one way. I think that all three are going to be fine. I think all three are going to be fine, excuse me, because at the end of the day, America doesn't support Israel for values and for moral reasons. I know that we all say it, and I know that they say it, and I know that Israelis hear it a lot. At the end of the day, America supports Israel because there aren't a lot of stable places you can support in the Middle East that will ensure stability and will ensure that the sea lanes are open and can be guaranteed to be an ally. The scale of the alliance at just strategic military levels is incredibly close. It's like, I don't know if you know about the Australian Navy, but the United States Navy is essentially the Navy that sails the world's sea lanes and keeps them open for trade. That is the global order. The United States Navy is the global security order of the world since the end of World War II, except around Australia. Because around Australia, the United States Navy just coordinates with the Australian Navy to be the annex of that massive global system in the area around Australia. So Australia functions as a kind of subsidiary global order keeper in its area with its Navy, and they literally coordinate missions and coordinate areas. Israel serves a function that's not completely different from that in the Middle East, and the Mossad works very closely with the United States. There are reasons for the close alliance that have nothing to do with friendship and joy and happiness. The American troops in Qatar are not there because they love Qatar's values. You know what I mean? So I suspect that there won't be that much damage. There'll be a lot of politics, with the Democrats and Netanyahu. I suspect that Lapid and Bennett can't screw up too much. There are deep underlying things happening here that I don't think are so dependent either on Biden or on who becomes Israel's prime minister.
Thank you for that. I'd now like to hand over to Helen Shardy. We'll just unmute you there, Helen. There should be a prompt to unmute. Beautiful.
Okay. Thank you, Haviv, for a very fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. I guess my question is going to be more about the heart and soul of the Jewish people in Israel. And as a progressive Jew, I would ask, what do you believe the reform and secular populations in Israel will support in the coming election? Do you believe they'll support a Bennett-Lapid coalition? I mean, what do they have to gain? Bennett's certainly not a friend of the reform movement, but the Lapid, Yesh Atid and Blue and White are. And so I'd just like to ask you what you believe they have to gain and who do you think they will support?
Yeah, so the first thing that has to be said is all Israeli governments, since the first one, I mean, the Mapai, the founding party of Israel under David Ben-Gurion at the very first elections, when it did, it had almost half of the Knesset, even it didn't have half the Knesset. Nobody ever has half, and they have to do alliances. And even Netanyahu's Likud Haredi alliance is deeply divided. So, for example, the great champion on the Supreme Court question in Likud is Amir Ohana, who's one of the most prominent gay rights activists in Israel, and on the question of Palestinians and the judicial reform is very conservative. But on everything social that the Haredim think is the most important thing in society, he's very, very liberal and is the voice of Likud on those things. So so there are always these alliances, deeply uncomfortable alliances of people, across deep fundamental divides of values. I would say that Bennett is interesting in that regard because he's a little bit American. He's a little bit American. And I mean literally, his parents are Olim from the United States. They're immigrants in the United States, but also he grew up a little bit in California. And when he lived in California, his family went to a conservative synagogue, which we don't say out loud today because who wants to embarrass the man, poor guy? He represents religious Zionism in Israel today. But you saw that when you saw the fight over the Western Wall, for example, the Kotel, and having so he's not willing to break the Orthodox monopoly at the Kotel. He's not willing to not have an Orthodox synagogue on the men's side and an Orthodox synagogue on the women's side, as Women of the Wall have demanded. But he is happy to have a third section and call it the Jewish people section, or and the reform movement can go there to do whatever it wants. And it was put together very quickly as sort of a, look, we'll really do it. You could really come to the Kotel, but he's happy to have that turn into a massive building and a serious thing. And he's very, very sensitive to liberal Jewish issues. He believes in Jewish unity, and he just knows reforming conservative Jews. So, we have a Haredi member of Knesset who everybody laughs out of the room because he says very silly things, but he's also elected, named Israel Eichler, who once said that the reason the Jews died in the Holocaust was that Reformed Jewish senators in the United States Senate in 1939 to 42 didn't want Orthodox Jews to come to America, wanted them to be exterminated so that they wouldn't challenge the reform movement in America. Now, he said that in public in front of cameras at a Knesset committee. It's Holocaust denial. I mean, it's Holocaust denial, right? And nobody called him out on it because the liberals think he's a joke, and the Haredim won't defend reforming no matter what happens, right? So Bennett hates them. That sense, that kind of Haredi using the word reforming in Hebrew is this bogeyman that's going to take over and ruin all holy sacred things in our country. Bennett sees as an enemy. He writes against them publicly. I don't think it is hard for a progressive Jew on the Palestinian question to vote Bennett, because he's the no Palestinian state, no way, no how, no matter what line of Israeli politics. On the question of religion's observance and religious freedom and opening up to liberal Jewish streams, Bennett should be a very comfortable ally. I'm sorry, I hope that, I don't know if that makes it easier for you. It might make it harder, but that's the divide.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for the answer. And I'd like to hand over to Aaron Shapiro.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Haviv. I see your your points about how Bennett has roots to the prime ministership, but I find it a little harder to see how he maintains it, because Netanyahu has a favorite drink at election time, and it's drinking Bennett's votes. And he's very good at especially anybody from the right-wing camp, chasing them back onto the Likud. And so I see right now, Bennett is polling well, but Netanyahu really hasn't strategized how to get those votes down. And Bennett has a very complicated tightrope to walk between, if he wants to keep all those seats, between disillusioned blue and white voters and people of that centrist ilk, and the people on the right. And it's a very uneasy relationship. I know Caroline Glick, the commentator, has already said how he's been softening his words and kind of selling out some of Yamina's principles to try and maintain that tightrope walk. But do you think that Bennett can do what others haven't, which is be able to keep that strength, even when Netanyahu says things like you're going to have a Prime Minister Lapid, which has worked for him in the past?
Yeah, Bennett has an advantage. So first, two things. First of all, before I did any of the math, I took away 10 seats. The first step in checking if this is a serious argument is to take away 40% of his polling support. It still works. So Netanyahu can win the next election, emphatically, but he has to do a very good job defying polls by double-digit percentages. Israeli polls are not so terrible. The final results of the polls have been generally within 3 or 4 seats correct. And we're not allowed to publish polls in the last 3 days. So the last 3 days of campaigning also are not reflected in polls. So there's that gap. So I'll just say that. In other words, if Netanyahu isn't worried about what I just described, then Netanyahu isn't the Netanyahu we know. He'd better be worried about this if he hopes to win. Can Netanyahu take away the next 8 seats, right, to really neutralize Bennett as this threat that could put Lapid over the top and get Bennett also his rotation, or turn Bennett into, make it a buyer's market for Bennett in the sense that Netanyahu will have to beg him for a rotation and nobody will let Netanyahu go first anymore. So in any case, Netanyahu is out of office. Can he do more to neutralize? Bennett enjoys an advantage in that he actually is to the right of Netanyahu on some really fundamental issues, including judicial reform. Netanyahu has been prime minister 11 years. In those 11 years, he invited Ehud Barak to be his defense minister for 4 years. He invited Yesh Atid and Hatnuah, left wing and center left and whatever, into his government. He went with Gantz on a rotation agreement. What's Bibi going to accuse Bennett of? He's going to accuse him of going with Lapid in a rotation agreement? I mean, it's literally what Netanyahu has done. What's Netanyahu going to say? Yes, but I was lying at the time, right? That's what's left to him to say. He has not advanced judicial reform at all. And not only has he not advanced judicial reform, the current makeup, this is very into the weeds, but it's not going to be into the weeds if Bennett gets on the defensive and starts going on the offensive in a campaign like that. The current makeup of the Judicial Appointments Committee, which gives, there's 9 members and you need 7 votes to appoint a Supreme Court justice. And there are 3 members of the Supreme Court on the committee, and they have never voted apart. They have never, in thousands of appointments of judges, the 3 representatives of the court on the committee have never not voted together on all those appointments. And therefore, the Supreme Court has a veto in Israel for who gets appointed to the Supreme Court, which does not exist anywhere else in any other democracy. The right isn't crazy for arguing that the Israeli Supreme Court needs reform and is the most powerful court in the democratic West. It probably is. Except that exact formula was produced by a 2002 law advanced by Likud, by Gideon Sa'ar of Likud. That law is the current system for how that committee works. So Bennett has a campaign Netanyahu being left wing. And I think it's a strong campaign. He didn't go that way back in the day when he said, vote for me, I'll keep Netanyahu right wing. But if he's completely going head to head against Netanyahu and they're only 8 seats apart in the polls, I don't see why Bennett doesn't have a much more convenient campaign about Netanyahu being a leftist than Netanyahu does about Bennett. I'm not giving him advice. By the way, possibly my raising this, I think the piece is also going to run in our Hebrew site. So possibly my raising this will, Bennett has this opportunity. The worst thing for Bennett is that Netanyahu voters think that Bennett will be the reason Netanyahu can't be prime minister. He'll probably lose 5 seats on that, right? So he has to pretend like he can go in all directions. If he's smart, he's the next prime minister.
Thank you for that. Now we'll hand over to Sharon Middleman.
Thanks, Haviv. In Australia, we've had strict lockdowns to deal with coronavirus, which have generally had bipartisan support. But in Israel, it seems to be a much more political issue. Why do you think the lockdowns have been so political, and how do you think that will impact the election results?
That's a great question. I think we are a very profoundly divided country into very different cultures and tribes. Among the Jews, there's I think a larger culture gap between secular Tel Aviv people and Haredi, people living in some large Haredi city. There's a bigger cultural gap there. They don't go to the same schools. They don't learn the same curriculum. They don't learn English. They don't learn math beyond about 4th grade in the Haredi curriculum. They live in a whole different world with different standards and different achievement, tracks and different life tracks and different ways of thinking about the world. And among the Arabs, it's not only that Jews and Arabs in Israel are very divided, literally live in different towns. Among the Arabs, there are these profound divisions. There are these progressive Arab community in Haifa, in the Galilee. Christian Arabs in the Galilee have higher educational achievement than Jews on average in Israel. In other words, they're in a very different place from, for example, the very conservative Muslim Bedouin of the South, where there's still polygamy on a large scale, and they're really living in a different cultural world. And so we're a very divided society. We look a lot more like the Middle East than we do like the West. So there's a kind of baseline Americanness to Americans, where even if they hate each other, they share some fundamental ideas and assumptions and identities and educations. In Israel, we don't. We literally have a 4-stream education system that has radically different curricula for the different groups of Israeli society. And so we look like Lebanon. We look like Syria culturally. I mean, in terms of the scale of the divides between the different religious groups, the different religious ways of living, lifestyles between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi and all the different kinds of Jews and all the different kinds of Arabs. And so when the government realized that the outbreak, the largest outbreak, the most significant outbreak was among the ultra-Orthodox, and then the government's virus czar, a man named Roni Gamzu, who until last month was the head of policy on that issue, recommended shutting down, just imposing the lockdown locally where the outbreaks were largest and most significant, and saving the economy everywhere else. That was ultra-Orthodox. That was all ultra-Orthodox areas. And the ultra-Orthodox just rebelled and said, what are you people, you, the other tribes of Israel, ganging up on us as if we are vectors of disease? If that's not anti-Semitism, what is? And then when they turned to the Arab community, the Arab mayors said, guys, you haven't given me any powers. My community it's exploding everywhere. I can't shut down malls. I don't have those basic emergency powers. The government didn't coordinate with the Arab community because the Arab parties aren't in the government for long and complex and difficult reasons that we could get into some other time, but are fascinating and you should read about. So the different communities have really responded as tribes and don't trust the other tribes to be looking out for themselves. There isn't a baseline solidarity. And the virus showed us that. We know it in the day-to-day. And there's some things we all agree on, like the Israeli army should be very strong because there's a bunch of Assads and Khamenei's in this region and Islamic states and whatnot in this region. On that, we all agree. By the way, most Israeli Arabs, when you ask them, should the IDF be very strong? They say yes. They also know that they'd rather be living in the Israel part of the Middle East than in the non-Israel part of the Middle East. And also many of them have begun to really feel, about half have begun to really call themselves Israeli when you ask them identity questions. So there is this kind of baseline having to do with self-defense, with mutual self-defense and things like that. But when you get down to domestic issues, and the pandemic is so domestic that it just highlights for us our own internal realities of our societies everywhere, for everyone. For the French, it's doing it. It's certainly doing it for us. Everything kind of fell apart into these distrustful tribes. So it wasn't even a political issue. It was this just deep social anger. And when you see all those seats abandoned Netanyahu, one of the great moments of triumph in his career with the normalization and Trump and the recognition of Jerusalem and the Golan and all this wonderful period, and suddenly so many people are abandoning him, it's because these basic sort of underlying divisions of Israeli society have come up and reared their heads, and those trump anything else. I mean, those dominate other things.
Thank you for that. I'd now like to hand over to Zvi Fleischer.
Hi, Haviv. Thank you for your intelligent remarks. Very interesting. I want to ask about the sort of coexistence of the Israeli moving to election and the coming in of the Biden administration. Do you think the fact that we'll have a Biden administration which will say they don't interfere in Israeli politics, but will, I think, make it clear they prefer someone other than Netanyahu, is that likely to have any effect in Israel, for or against Netanyahu? And secondly, I've seen it argued that having an election now is a good thing because you need a united voice in Israel to deal with Israel's interests with the Biden administration, and the Israeli government at the moment is divided. And you're better off with anybody who can say, I speak for Israel. And therefore, despite the fact that Israelis, of course, don't want another election after 3 and 2 years and are in the middle of a pandemic, that it's a good thing. I'd like your view on that.
A government's a wonderful thing. It's wonderful to have a foreign policy that's coherent. It's wonderful to have a state budget. The fact that Netanyahu has refused to pass a state budget to avoid the rotation has been a crime, an absolute crime. And you know, I don't care if you vote for him, you need to recognize that that's a crime. The school year started in Israel, and 5,000 tutors for disadvantaged youth who get special tutoring for literally reading classes weren't hired because the budget wasn't passed. And when you don't have a state budget, every single little expenditure has to pass in a separate stopgap bill. So there's been this long series of stopgap bills, and many things have fallen by the wayside. So the lack of a government has meant we have just tremendous mistakes and problems. And the fact that the government is so divided, also, you saw this with the F-35 situation. Netanyahu negotiates this fantastic normalization deal. Everyone's amazed. Then suddenly one newspaper, a very anti-Netanyahu newspaper, breaks this astonishing discovery that actually the deal is that we get normalization and the Emiratis get to buy F-35s. And Netanyahu denies and denies and denies and denies. And then it turns out that that's kind of how the Emiratis understood the deal. And then it turns out that that's kind of how the Americans understood the deal. And then it turns out that Netanyahu surprised the foreign ministry and the defense ministry because he didn't want to give any credit for the normalization to Gantz and Ashkenazi, the foreign minister, who are both from blue and white. And so they weren't part of the negotiations. And so there was no Israeli defense official. There was no Israeli, military experts at the table asking the fundamental questions about what this means for the military alliance, and what this means for Emirati military capabilities, and what it means if the Emiratis have a fleet of 50 F-35s, and then their government falls and they're toppled, and the Muslim Brotherhood or some Shiite regime comes to power under the thumb of Iran. What does that mean? Nobody actually negotiated that. And Gantz quietly flew to Washington with a whole delegation, met with Defense Secretary Esper, and they negotiated a deal and signed the deal It's literally a document that they both signed. It's an agreement between Israel and the United States on paper about how qualitative military edge would be maintained for Israel when they sell the F-35s to the United States. In other words, Netanyahu potentially caused real harm just for the fact that the government is so divided, and he's constantly, tap dancing around, letting anyone else have credit, and trying to avoid Gantz getting not only credit but obviously ever being prime minister. So this divided government, even in moments of triumph, manages to screw up terribly. And in things that actually matter to most Israelis, there are 1 million Israelis out of work right now. We're not a large population. That's a lot of Israelis. Things that actually matter to us, this government has failed on miserably. There's a reason there's so much anger at Netanyahu, and it has nothing to do with his trial. So that's, we need that. Do we need to speak in a unified voice with the Americans? There I'm a little bit more skeptical. I think it's pretty rare in the history of Israel that the prime minister, defense minister, and foreign minister, the three people theoretically speaking to the Americans on a regular basis, have been from the same party and even have had the same policy at the largest, grand strategy level. I think that's pretty rare. I don't think it's ever been. I think the Americans know how to speak to us. As Kissinger once complained, the Israelis have no foreign policy. They only have domestic policy that they sort of impose onto their foreign policy. I think we could say that today about the Americans. Every administration that came to power, Obama came to power feeling profoundly the need to be anti-Bush. Whatever Bush was doing, we're going to do the opposite. And it led them to unnecessary, silly mistakes. I'm not going to get into that, but it did. Trust me, I have a long list of them. And then Trump comes to power knowing he's the anti-Obama. And so he starts doing things around the world that are literally just to be anti-Obama. And some of those are terrible mistakes too. And now Biden's coming to power. And the question is he going to run his foreign policy through that domestic lens like his two predecessors? Or is he going to have a thoughtful and thought out foreign policy that is a little wiser? We don't know yet. I'm not so concerned about that, about Israel speaking in one voice. Israel's basic strategic, everyone speaks in a different voice, but Israel's basic strategic needs are universal. I mean, we could have a foreign minister from the Balad party, and as long as he's a loyal Israeli, as long as he's not actually seeking the destruction of Israel, which some Balad MKs have had to flee the country for spying for Hezbollah, as long as he's not them, that MK will say the same thing as Netanyahu in those negotiations. Qualitative military edge, for example. So I'm not too worried.
Sorry, Joel, we've just lost you there. We still can't get you there. So what we'll do is we'll hand over to the final questioner of the night. I'll hand over to AIJAC's Jeremy Jones.
Thank you. Haviv, it's been a really interesting presentation tonight. We had many questions that unfortunately we don't have time to get to. We want to know, for instance, who's going to be the next president, what the relationship is going to be with Palestinians, etc. But unfortunately, as I said, we've run out of time, and you're our last speaker from Israel during the year 2020. And my question is, what causes are there for optimism for supporters of Israel and friends of Israel leading into 2021?
Optimism. I think all the causes in the world, Israeli, if you take it, you just go through issues one by one. Militarily, the Iranian president, Rouhani, just presented a budget for Iran of $33 billion, which includes something like 40% increase in funding for all the different military forces, the IRGC, the Standing Army, the propaganda organizations run by the daughter of Qasem Soleimani, massive across the board defense spending increase. But the entire national budget is $33 billion. Israel's national budget is about $170 billion. And Israel's population is about 1/7 of Iran's population. if I'm not mistaken. It's all on Wikipedia. You don't have to trust me on this. Israel is strong, and Israel is capable, and Israel is confident and competent. We have real strengths also in terms of recovery. We saw that coming out of each wave of lockdown. We're all very angry at our government for the lockdown, for the irresponsibility of the lack of a budget, for the deadlock, for the hatred, for the campaigns that turn us against each other. We're already so turned against each other that we don't need the politicians' help on that score. We're angry at our politics, but at the same time, the recovery after each round, and you saw this when Moody's released its report on Israel and left the credit rating unchanged. And you saw it when S&P did the same thing. And they all went to the same point. And it's a point that, the Bank of Israel's monetary policy is very wise and very thoughtful. The fundamentals of the economy are very strong. We have spent 15 years bringing down our sovereign debt to, I think it was 60% of our GDP. America has the national federal debt is like 110% of its GDP. It's just astonishing, and they spend hundreds of billions every year just paying the interest on their federal debt. They can't pay for healthcare. Now we have universal healthcare, and maybe that's not so exciting to Australians, but it's very exciting when I say it to Americans. And we actually live about 4 years longer than Americans. Israeli secular Jews have a rising birth rate, which is important economically. If you're very concerned about, demographics and national futures and things like that, one of the dangers faced by, for example, Iran and Iran's economy looking forward 30 years is that their birth rate has dropped to Russian levels, and they're simply not going to be able to sustain a welfare state going forward. And yet they're still spending double-digit percentages of their economy on their militaries and on their adventures around the Middle East. The fundamentals in Israel are very, very strong. And they remain strong. And Benjamin Netanyahu has his good days in which he's extraordinary and delivers extraordinary successes. And he has his terrible days in which he compensates for the good days. But we've had, a series of really, Ehud Olmert on the economy was wonderful. Ehud Olmert is remembered for other problems, but as a basic fundamental political class that cares about the country and tries to deliver for the country when it doesn't hurt their political prospects, we have that. Our democracy is very strong. Nobody gets silenced. We have every problem under the sun. We have every problem that every Middle Eastern country is dealing with. By the way, we come from Tsarist Russia and the Middle East. We don't come from the English-speaking West. So we are, it's a little bit of a sort of cultural disconnect to compare us to the English-speaking world and say, oh, you don't match up here, you don't match up there. We don't belong there. We never came from there. We never, Israelis didn't have a constitutional convention, don't know about the Magna Carta. It's not, and yet our democracy is very strong. This democracy of Tsarist Russians and Arabs, I'm talking about the Jews now, right? Built this powerful democracy that works. So we have basic fundamental underlying cultural strengths that'll see us through, and we're doing okay. Our enemies, build, but they're building the wrong things, and we're very strong. My wife had a fascinating discussion with the deputy foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates, and she said she's involved in this important public crowdsourced lobbying phenomenon, which is actually fascinating. And she handles a lot of issues in the government. She's a former advisor to a senior minister. And she was on this discussion and she said to this deputy foreign minister, we Israelis understand your desire for this normalization and for a warm peace, essentially as the Americans are leaving the Middle East. And you want us to be the sort of filler Americans. Now we're a poor man's Americans, right? We're not America. We're not as powerful as America, but we have an advantage as an ally in the Middle East in that we can't leave it. We are stuck. So we're more reliable. We're less powerful, but more reliable. And so you want us on your side in the future facing Iran. That's how we understand the normalization. And this deputy foreign minister off camera in a conversation organized by some European charity to have this discussion about normalization, he responded, actually, we already, I mean, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, we already have you on Iran. You think that if Iran invades us, the next invasion is you. We were already cooperating. It's not like anybody didn't know. What we actually want is the fact that you have no oil and everyone has jobs. How do you do that? That's what we actually want. What we actually want is your ability to produce this incredible power out of nothing, out of no natural resources. That's what we really want. And you can do that. We want to invest in you and we want you to come invest in us. And then he said, we also have chutzpah and we want to prove it to you. So we have these strengths that they know about. The Arab world knows about its crisis. It knows that it's going through this terrible crisis of modernity. It knows that literacy is declining in the Arab world and it's rising everywhere else in the world. It knows that 300 million Arabs with a third of the world's oil don't build a car. They know it. They talk about it every day. It's in all their press. And some of them have started to think that maybe what Israelis have managed to do, by the way, half of Israelis are Iraqis and Egyptians and Yemenites. And how come they came to Israel and started doing all these wonderful things? What do the Israelis know that we don't? That, I think, is, if anything guarantees a long-term normalization, it's not that right now we have this enemy in the Khamenei and his Ayatollah friends. It's that basic fundamental strength.
Thank you, Haviv. That's a fantastic way to end tonight's webinar. Apologies to those that still have their hands raised for questions. I apologize for not being able to get to you tonight. Thank you again, Haviv. That was a magnificent presentation, incredibly fascinating to our audience, and we greatly appreciate it. So on behalf of AIJAC, thank you very much.